Iris Ruth Pastor, and we're here for a little small talk with artist Andrea Connell, whose ceramic sculptures are on exhibit at the Florida Holocaust Museum through August 15th. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you.
It is my understanding that most of your work deals with the burden of coming to terms with past traumatic experiences. And I understand that your grandparents were Holocaust survivors and they were greatly affected by their experiences, and that you really feel that subsequent generations, meaning I suppose your parents and you and any siblings that you have, were also affected by this trauma. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. And one of the things one of the terms that you use is intergenerational trauma. And I found that to be a very compelling term. And at the same time, you asked some very interesting questions. And you said, what happens when an individual psyche is altered by a traumatic event? And what happens when a wound is so deep and painful that you have to become emotionally numb to survive? So talking about this intergenerational trauma and relating it back to these questions, I was curious how you tied that together.
Well, it's interesting because my research really started from a genuine interest in psychoanalysis, and that was rooted in wanting to understand the behaviors and actions that occurred in my family, and particularly going back to my grandmother's experience. I didn't know my grandfather. He passed away before I was born, so it was mostly rooted in my grandmother. And I really started to come up with my own theory or idea of how traumatic situations or traumatic experiences can be passed through the family from one generation to the next, even if those experiences are not spoken of, because they have no way of disappearing. So I talk about how, if somebody has experienced something terribly traumatic, that experience stays with you whether you speak of it or not. And you kind of come within this cloud of anxieties and fears and all of this. And that is, as a child, growing up in a household that has that kind of palpable fear, you become susceptible to it. And it's like a learned trait. So it almost is like it becomes a part of you, and then you pass it on to your children, and on and on and on. And then I found out that there actually is this new theory called intergenerational trauma, which is the passing on of patterns and behaviors, whether or not you had the actual experience. And it can come in very interesting ways, and such like when I was a child, I didn't know about my grandparents' experience. They didn't speak of it at all. I didn't even know that I was Jewish. But I had dreams of war, and I had dreams of tanks coming down my street and me running to my mother and saying, "You said this could never happen." And she would look at me and she'd say, "This can always happen. War can always happen." And that I had that dream many times as a child.
You just said that your grandparents didn't talk about it. Your grandmother didn't talk about it. When I was reading the information on you and your exhibit, you talk about that how your grandparents moved to Virginia after the war, changed their name from, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, Zevo to Collin, Collin. They started attending a Baptist church and began rebuilding their life, and that your grandmother said she just wanted to blend into the wallpaper. And honestly, going from Eastern European Jews to Southern Baptists was pretty much of a change. So what happened? What's your take on this? How did you learn you were Jewish? I'd like to know how the events unfolded.
Sure. Well, I was brought up with no real religious background. My father and I would say a prayer together when I was little, but I didn't go to church. The Baptist thing or the Christian thing was kind of dropped after I think really like after my mom probably went to high school or something, she started to make her own decisions. And my grandparents, I don't think that they really attended church. So it was a facade,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And they didn't want to speak of the past, and they were fearful. They were fearful for their children, and they were fearful for themselves. They knew what it was like to lose everything, and they had this idea, I think, that in order to be safe, you should blend in, which, is really like, if you think about it, it's just, it's unbelievable that they tried so hard for this, because they came there with these heavy Hungarian accents. They were immigrants, in this small town in Virginia. And everybody knew. That's the ironic part about it. My mom found out recently that the people in the town knew where they were from.
The other thing that I thought was interesting is that you did a piece called Saturated Sorrow in 2010, and the story that I read behind it talked about how when your grandmother passed away, your mother found a book about how to love with her things, which brings tears to my eyes right now.
Yeah.
That's so sad. How did your mom and how did you cope with that, and how did your grandmother cope with that inability to really transcend the fear and let the feelings flow? How did you all deal with that?
I don't really know.
Well, you started doing sculpture. That could be.
I started doing sculpture. My mom is an artist also. And the funny thing is I think, my mom and I were born as incredibly loving people. And I think that was the natural core of my grandmother also. It was hardened. And it was replaced with fear.
Sure.
Fear of losing somebody that you attached love to. And so she started to act out in her behaviors and in her location by separating herself from those that really wanted to be close to her, like my mom and myself and her son. She moved to Toronto, Canada when my mom was 18. She moved there with my grandfather, and my grandfather passed away in 1980. I believe it was 1980. And she stayed there, and she would come to visit us once or twice a year. And she never once said, "I love you." When I would talk to her on the phone, and I would say, "Okay, love you, Nana." It kind of became my mission to say, "I love you." That actually probably is how I came to cope with it the most, was that I made it kind of like my rebellion. It's like,
You were going to say it if she wasn't.
Right. So I'd be like, "Love you, Nana." And she'd say, "Okay, bye-bye."
That's interesting how you did that in your attempt to break through. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your participation and sharing your thoughts. Is there anything before we close that you want to add?
In every way possible, I'm trying to respect this memory and be a witness for my grandmother and grandfather for what they couldn't speak about. And I think that is important and necessary in resolving certain issues that keep creating war and genocide and abuse and many different forms of trauma. This is not just work that I do to talk about the Holocaust. I think anybody who's experienced a traumatic situation or is close to somebody who has can take something from this. And I hope that the conversation can be very broad.
Thank you so much. I'm Iris Ruth Pastor, a contributor to Let My People Know, an outreach engagement initiative.